So that, it leads us to the question, what would a socialist alternative to the Democrats look like? It must adopt a strong socialist program for economic democracy and social ownership of the means of production, right? It's got to be socialist, not merely reforms of capitalism. I know a lot of people credit Bernie with bringing socialism to the mainstream, but the problem with how he did it was that he also distorted it while doing it. And I honestly, I don't put much blame on Bernie personally for this. Bernie didn't say the word socialism very much after the very, very beginning. Because I think Bernie probably is at least some level of a socialist. It was like, this isn't socialism. This is social, democracy. This is social welfare capitalism. So, a key part of what would a socialist alternative to the Democrats look like is it would be socialist, right? It wouldn't just reform capitalism. And as I said earlier, right, when you're reforming capitalism from within the capitalist parties, you're guaranteeing that there's a ceiling to what your reforms can do. They will not allow themselves to be reformed out of existence, right? That's just not something that is going to happen. So what does a socialist alternative to the Democrats look like? It's also got to be politically independent. Political independence must be adopted as a key principle, not merely a tactic to be used or dropped each election cycle. And I think that each election cycle is important, right? It's important for independent socialist organizers. It's important for Greens to understand we're talking about long-term organizing. We're talking about long-term community building. We're talking about long-term empowerment. We're not talking about immediate gratification wins and, jumping cycle to cycle to cycle. We really have to be focused, on putting the work in on that long-term ground game. So that means we need to be working on independent funding, right? Self-funded by workers and communities. Howie had a article during the campaign called Sanders Socialism is New Deal Liberalism, which is correct, right? Sanders is a New Dealer, or his policies are. His presidential campaign policies were New Deal, reforms, essentially. But in that article, in that essay, he talked about how when Clinton was elected, he had the most moderate of moderate economic reforms in his program. And even then, what he learned was Wall Street gets a veto. Right? If you are not independently funded, that means capital will have the power to defund you, to shut you down. And that's what the Democratic Party of Nevada learned, right? That's what the Las Vegas DSA learned, or the DSA in Nevada learned when they took over the party, was that all of a sudden the funding dried up, the staff quit, and it was, just the leadership sitting there trying, and part of the leadership was probably working against them. So if you don't have that independent funding, you're, really building your party on an unstable stack of cards. And not only that, it's an unstable stack of cards where the capitalists have a bat and they can take you down at any point, right? Independent ballot lines, working class candidates running on their own ballot lines with their own identity. Again, super, super important, right? Because there is, there's always the rallying call from progressives to run and win in the primaries, but they don't, right? They run into many of the same problems that the third parties run into, right? They're a grassroots campaign that's ran on passion and no money, and they're running against someone who's been sitting in office raising $50,000 a day for their entire term, or $50,000 a week, or whatever the goal is for a U.S. House member, right? So they go in and they put everything into these primaries, and then in the end, what are they left with? Right? They're in the same exact spot where they were, but they're actually have tied themselves into a party and into a strategy that leads them to then endorse vote for the person that beat them, vote for the person they didn't think should be there.
We had a funny story about this in Pittsburgh a few years back, where a progressive candidate that was inspired by Bernie Sanders ran for city council in the Democratic primary, and actually won the primary, was the Democratic nominee. The Democratic establishment of Pittsburgh got together, funded an insider to run as an independent, and flooded the campaign with so much money that they won as an independent. And they got the Democratic insider into office on an independent. and so the Progressive was stuck with the Democratic name. Instead of building institutions that were going to allow a longer working class movement, like that win didn't mean anything and didn't build anything. So it's important for us to get our own funding and our own ballot line with our own identity instead of being tied to the Democrats, because actually the Democrats, they're not really, as that issue showed, they're not really that tied to the name Democratic Party either. It's about keeping their control. And if they have to pick another name or something like that, they will. So really this conversation is about building working class power, building our own institutions where we can actually, raise ourselves up and actually engage in self-determination. Like
Nathaniel said, like India Walton in Buffalo, New York, who defeated their incumbent mayor in the primary. But then that mayor ran as an independent or a write-in and beat one in the general, right? And that's another one of the problems with the strategy of running within the primaries, is that there's a much smaller voting pool in the primaries, right? It tends to be passionate people that vote in the primaries. I remember people in 2016 talking about how, Bernie's filling stadiums and Hillary's not even filling high school gyms, and that means something. Well, when you're the institutional candidate, you don't need to fill a stadium. You've got the votes, right? You've locked down the superdelegates. You've locked down all of your committee precinct people, right? So the people in the neighborhood who want Bernie are going and talking to Democrats in their community only to find out that they're already locked in. And so,
especially in a party with superdelegates, you how much does the primary vote even matter?
Yeah. So, even when you can sway the primaries, that's a smaller sample of largely uber engaged voters. But when you get to the general, now you have to, deal with, a more moderate base. Usually, it's why in all primaries in both Republicans and Democrats, it's usually a battle between the institution and more extremes, but then they run right back to the center when it comes to the general. And tying into that, an independent socialist party needs, emoji, that's who we were talking about, was India Walton in Buffalo. It needs member control. Just as we call for social ownership of the means of production, the party itself must be owned by the members, right? Without independent leftist candidates running on the socialist program, the idea of socialism is watered down into what the Democratic Party is, and what progressive Democrats are doing, which is mere reform and government programs, not social ownership, which was, the absolute key. It's the basic definition of socialism.